US sanctions on Cuba aim to isolate my country from the rest of the world, but every year at the United Nations, it's the US that's isolated.
The UN General Assembly overwhelmingly
called for the United States to lift its 60-year economic blockade on Cuba.
Every year since 1992, Cuba has presented a resolution at the UN calling for an end to the US embargo. And every year, nearly every country votes in favor of the resolution.
185 to 2.
Surely the democracy-loving United States will see this and say, hey, democracy wins. Time to end the embargo.
If only. 2 countries have voted year after year against ending U.S. sanctions on Cuba. The United States, of course, and Israel. Most members of the UN understand the terrible impact sanctions have on the Cuban people. Most people in the US oppose them too.
Sanctions is violence, and I think that deciding whether or not people get access to food and medicine because of what politics that they choose is totally ridiculous.
It's really just colonialism and racism. That's really all it is. It's very simple.
Sanctions are economic warfare. And under the Trump and Biden administration, the US's war on Cuba has become more destructive than ever. Right now, Cuba is facing one of the worst crises in recent history. Sanctions are a big reason why, but it's rare that any major media outlet reports on this. In fact, it's rare they report on Cuba at all, unless something terrible happens.
Nationwide power outage in Cuba, plunging 10 million people into the dark.
The aging power grid collapsed 4 times over the weekend alone.
I just want to make clear that this is not, the U.S. is not to blame for the blackout. A critical tenet of the Biden-Harris administration policy as it relates towards Cuba is to always advocate for the support of the Cuban people.
How are the sanctions advocating for the support of the people in Cuba? I don't get it. Do you? U.S. sanctions on Cuba also violate international law, which all states under the UN Charter are supposed to respect.
The embargo is immoral and unethical. It is an act which strives systematically to reduce an entire people to hardship and famine. While some countries comply with and uphold international law and multilateralism, others treat this General Assembly in a disgraceful way.
Flaunting international law is nothing new for the U.S. or Israel. Israel's genocide in Gaza, which is funded by the U.S., by the way, has killed more than 40,000 Palestinians in the last year. Recently, Israeli soldiers even opened fire on UN peacekeepers in Lebanon. In September, the UN voted overwhelmingly for Israel to end its occupation of Palestine. Just like the vote on the Cuban embargo, the resolution has been ignored. On October 30th, the UN will vote yet again on the resolution presented by Cuba. Share your thoughts and stay informed as we follow the results.